The news arrived with a chilling finality. Tanzanian authorities had deregistered the Glory of Christ Church. This was not just an administrative decision, it was a move that silenced a prominent voice. The church, led by Bishop Josephat Gwajima, had become a focal point of dissent. Its closure sent ripples of unease across the nation and beyond. Many saw it as a stark warning to those who dared to question the state. The government's action was swift, leaving little room for appeal or immediate recourse for the congregation. The deregistration effectively outlawed the church's operations. Its doors were forced shut and its services were halted. For the followers of Bishop Gwajima, this was a profound blow. Their place of worship, a sanctuary for many, was suddenly declared illegitimate. The official reasons given would soon emerge. However, the timing and context were highly suggestive. The church's leader had been increasingly vocal in his criticism of government actions. This act of shutting down a religious institution raised immediate concerns about religious freedom in Tanzania. This development occurred in a sensitive political climate. Tanzania was, and still is, navigating a complex period. The legacy of the late President John Magufuli loomed large. His successor, President Samia Suluhu Hassan, had promised reforms. Yet incidents like the closure of Gwajima's church cast shadows on these promises. Observers questioned whether this was an isolated incident or part of a broader strategy to consolidate power and suppress critical voices. The implications were significant, touching upon fundamental rights. The closure of the Glory of Christ Church was more than a legal maneuver. It represented a clash between a powerful religious figure and the state apparatus. It brought to the forefront uncomfortable questions about the limits of free speech. It also highlighted the delicate balance between maintaining public order, as the government might claim, and upholding democratic principles. The story of this church and its outspoken bishop became a case study. It showed the challenges faced by those who step out of line in an increasingly controlled environment. Bishop Josephat Gwajima was not a subtle critic. He was a lawmaker, a member of the ruling Chama cha Mapinduzi party. This made his denunciations even more striking. He was, in theory, an insider. Yet he chose to use his pulpit, a powerful platform in a deeply religious country, to voice grave concerns. He spoke of matters that made many uncomfortable. He accused elements within the government of serious misdeeds. These were not veiled suggestions. They were direct allegations that captured public attention. His sermons often transcended purely spiritual matters. Bishop Gwajima delved into the murky waters of Tanzanian politics. He spoke about alleged government involvement in abductions. He raised the issue of enforced disappearances. These are terrifying terms in any context. Coming from a prominent bishop and ruling party MP, they carried immense weight. He had once been an ally of the late President Magufuli. This past association perhaps gave him a sense of protection, or a belief that he could speak truth to power without severe repercussions. The bishop's criticisms did not go unnoticed. In a country where the line between party loyalty and national interest can blur, his words were seen as a betrayal by some. To others, he was a courageous voice. He articulated the fears and suspicions that many harbored privately but dared not express openly. His congregation at the Glory of Christ Church grew, drawn by his charismatic preaching and his willingness to tackle sensitive issues. He became a figure of hope for some, and a problem for others within the establishment. The core of Gwajima's accusations revolved around a breakdown of security and justice. He painted a picture of a state, or parts of it, operating outside the bounds of law. His condemnation of abductions and disappearances struck a raw nerve. These are tactics associated with repressive regimes. His decision to speak out so forcefully, from his church and as a lawmaker, set him on a collision course with powerful forces. The government, it seemed, would only tolerate such dissent for so long before taking decisive action. The government did not frame the deregistration of Glory of Christ Church as a political act. Officially, the reasons were administrative. Officials claimed that Bishop Gwajima's remarks violated the standards expected of religious organizations. They argued that churches should not be platforms for political agitation. They suggested that his sermons had strayed too far from spiritual guidance. The state maintained it was upholding the law, ensuring that religious bodies operated within their designated remits. This official justification, however, was met with considerable skepticism. The timing was too convenient for many observers. The church was shut down shortly after Gwajima made some of his most damning public statements. Critics pointed out that religious leaders in Tanzania, and indeed across Africa, have often played a role in social and political commentary. To suddenly declare such commentary out of bounds seemed selective. It appeared to target Gwajima specifically because of the nature of his criticism, not merely because he was being political. The authorities emphasized that religious freedom was still protected. They argued that the action against Gwajima's church was not an attack on religion itself. Instead, it was a necessary measure to prevent the misuse of religious platforms. The government's narrative was one of maintaining order and ensuring that religious institutions did not incite unrest or undermine national unity. They presented Bishop Gwajima as an individual who had crossed a line, forcing their hand through his purported misconduct and inflammatory rhetoric. Yet the explanation struggled to convince those who saw a pattern of shrinking civic space. If the issue was truly about the conduct of one bishop, were there no other avenues? Were warnings issued? Was there a process of engagement before the ultimate step of deregistration? These questions lingered. The government's stated reasons, while legally couched, did little to dispel the perception that the closure was punitive. It looked like a clear message to anyone, especially those with public platforms, to tread carefully when criticizing the state. The concerns raised by Bishop Gwajima about abductions and killings were not isolated. They found an echo in a powerful institution, the Tanzania Episcopal Conference. Representing the Catholic bishops in the country, the TEC added its significant voice to the growing disquiet. During their 5th Eucharistic Congress in September 2024, a notable event, they did not mince words. Their condemnation of the rising tide of violence was clear and unambiguous. This was a major religious body speaking out. Bishop Eusebius Alfred Nzigilwa, the TEC vice president, delivered a strong message. He called directly on state authorities. He urged them to take decisive action. The goal, he stated, was to restore peace and stability across Tanzania. The bishops were witnessing a deterioration of the security situation. They felt compelled to address it publicly. Their statement was not just a lament, it was a demand for accountability and effective governance from those entrusted with protecting citizens. The TEC's intervention was significant for several reasons. The Catholic Church holds considerable moral authority in Tanzania. Its pronouncements carry weight with a large segment of the population. Unlike an individual like Gwajima, who could be dismissed as a rogue element, the TEC represented a collective, established institution. Their concerns could not be easily brushed aside as mere political maneuvering. They were highlighting a systemic problem impacting the entire nation, not just one specific church or individual. This public stance by the Catholic bishops underscored the gravity of the situation. It suggested that the fears about abductions and unexplained killings were widespread. It also indicated that faith leaders were increasingly feeling the responsibility to speak up where political opposition might be stifled. The TEC's call for action put further pressure on President Samia Suluhu Hassan's administration. It demonstrated that the unease was not confined to opposition parties or activist groups. It was now resonating from the pulpits of one of the country's most respected religious bodies. Section 5: Whispers of Fear, Abductions, and the Erosion of Peace. The backdrop to the church deregistration and the bishop's concerns was a pervasive climate of fear. Reports of abductions and killings had become alarmingly frequent. These were not ordinary crimes. Many incidents bore the hallmarks of politically motivated violence or actions by unaccountable state agents. Individuals would disappear, some would later be found dead, others were never seen again. This created an atmosphere of terror and uncertainty, eroding the sense of peace and security for ordinary Tanzanians. These incidents were not always widely reported in mainstream media, often due to self-censorship or direct pressure. However, social media and human rights networks became channels for disseminating information and raising alarms. The stories that emerged were deeply disturbing. They spoke of individuals being taken by unidentified men, often in unmarked vehicles. The lack of due process, the absence of information about their whereabouts, and the impunity with which these acts seemed to occur fueled public anxiety and anger. Bishop Gwajima's sermons had tapped into this widespread fear. He gave voice to what many were whispering. The Tanzania Episcopal Conference's statement confirmed that these were not isolated anxieties. The problem was significant enough to warrant a public condemnation from the collective Catholic leadership. This erosion of peace and the rise of such brutal tactics signaled a dangerous trend for the country. It harkened back to darker periods in the region's history, where state-sponsored violence was used to silence dissent and maintain control. The government's response to these allegations was often defensive or dismissive. They would promise investigations, but tangible results and accountability were rare. This lack of effective action only deepened the mistrust between the citizenry and the state. It made the pronouncements of figures like Gwajima and the tech even more critical. They were filling a void, speaking out against injustices that the state seemed unwilling or unable to address comprehensively, thus further challenging the official narrative of stability and progress. Section 6. Defending Sovereignty. President Hassan's Stand. Faced with mounting criticism, both domestically and from international quarters, President Samia Suluhu Hassan adopted a firm stance. She issued warnings to foreign diplomats. She cautioned them against interfering in Tanzania's internal affairs. Her message was clear: Tanzania is a sovereign nation. Her administration would handle investigations into politically linked violence independently. This was a classic assertion of national sovereignty, often invoked by leaders when under scrutiny for human rights issues. President Hassan's position came at a time of heightened concern over the country's human rights record. International bodies and foreign governments had begun to express their worries more openly. The deregistration of Gwajima's church was one among several incidents that drew external attention. The president's response suggested an unwillingness to bow to international pressure. She framed external criticism as an unwelcome intrusion, potentially undermining her government's efforts and national unity. This assertion of sovereignty, while understandable from a national leader's perspective, also served to deflect from the substantive issues being raised. By focusing on foreign interference, the administration could attempt to rally nationalist sentiment. It could also try to discredit domestic critics by implying they were acting in concert with external forces. This tactic is not uncommon. It aims to shift the debate from the alleged abuses to the legitimacy of those who are pointing them out. President Hassan's administration had inherited a complex situation. There were hopes that she would usher in an era of greater openness and respect for human rights compared to her predecessor. While some positive steps were noted initially, actions like the church closure and the strong rhetoric against foreign scrutiny raised questions. It suggested a continuity of certain state practices. The challenge for her government was to demonstrate that its commitment to independent investigations would lead to genuine accountability and justice, not just serve as a shield against criticism. Section 7. Alarm sounded, rights groups and opposition react. The government's actions, particularly the deregistration of the Glory of Christ Church, did not occur in a vacuum. They triggered immediate and strong reactions from human rights organizations and opposition political parties within Tanzania. These groups were already on high alert. They had been documenting what they saw as a systematic erosion of fundamental freedoms. The move against Bishop Gwajima's church was, for them, another piece of disturbing evidence in a growing pattern of repression. Rights groups issued statements condemning the deregistration. They viewed it as a direct assault on freedom of religion, freedom of association, and freedom of expression. They argued that shutting down a church because its leader criticized the government set a dangerous precedent. It sent a chilling message to all religious institutions. It implied that their right to exist was conditional on their silence or support for the government's agenda. This, they contended, was incompatible with democratic principles and constitutional guarantees. Opposition parties also voiced their deep concerns. They saw the government's measures as politically motivated. They believed these actions were designed to silence critical voices and weaken any form of dissent, especially with future elections on the horizon. Leaders from various opposition factions pointed out that Bishop Gwajima, despite being a CCM MP, was targeted because he dared to speak out on sensitive issues like abductions. This, they argued, showed the government's intolerance for any criticism, even from within its own ranks. These groups collectively painted a picture of a shrinking civic space in Tanzania. They highlighted the increasing pressure on journalists, activists, and anyone perceived as challenging the official narrative. The warnings to foreign entities were also seen in this light. They were interpreted as an attempt to isolate domestic critics and prevent international scrutiny of the country's human rights situation. The collective alarm from these diverse groups underscored the perceived severity of the government's actions and their potential long-term consequences for Tanzanian society. Section 8. The shrinking space. Freedom of expression under pressure. The controversy surrounding Bishop Gwajima and the Glory of Christ Church is symptomatic of a broader, more troubling trend in Tanzania: the steady constriction of space for free expression. This is not a new phenomenon, but recent events have intensified concerns. The ability of citizens, journalists, activists, and even religious leaders to speak openly and critically about governmental affairs appears to be increasingly curtailed. This has profound implications for the health of democracy and the protection of human rights in the nation. Various tactics are reportedly employed to stifle dissent. These range from restrictive legislation and regulatory measures to more direct forms of intimidation and harassment. The deregistration of a church is a stark example, but there are also reports of journalists facing threats, media outlets being pressured, and online speech being heavily monitored. The cumulative effect is a climate of fear. Many individuals and organizations may choose self-censorship to avoid potential repercussions, leading to a less informed public discourse. President Hassan's administration had raised hopes for a departure from some of the more repressive tendencies of the past. However, the continued use of strong-arm tactics against critics suggests that systemic changes are slow or selective. The government's emphasis on national unity and development is often used to justify restrictions on expression. Criticism is sometimes framed as unpatriotic or detrimental to progress. This narrative makes it difficult for dissenting voices to gain traction or be seen as legitimate contributors to the national conversation. The impact of this shrinking space is far-reaching. It hampers accountability, as those in power face less scrutiny. It can lead to poor governance, as alternative perspectives and warnings about potential problems are suppressed. It also undermines the ability of citizens to participate meaningfully in their own governance. For Tanzania to realize its full potential, fostering an environment where open debate and critical inquiry are valued, not punished, is essential. The current trajectory, unfortunately, seems to point in a different direction for many observers. Section 9. Tanzania at a precipice between faith, fear, and the future. Tanzania finds itself at a critical juncture. The recent events, from the deregistration of the Glory of Christ Church to the outspoken concerns of the Catholic bishops and the government's defensive posture, paint a complex picture. It is a nation grappling with the delicate balance between state authority and individual freedoms. It is a society where faith plays a profound role, yet where fear also casts a long shadow. The path Tanzania chooses in the coming months and years will significantly shape its future. The core issue revolves around the fundamental rights of its citizens. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom of assembly are not luxuries. They are essential components of a democratic and just society. When these freedoms are curtailed, whether through direct state action or by fostering a climate of intimidation, the entire nation suffers. The vibrant exchange of ideas is stifled. Accountability diminishes. The potential for peaceful, constructive change is reduced, often replaced by simmering discontent or outright repression. The international community watches with keen interest, but as President Hassan has made clear, Tanzanians themselves must navigate these challenges. The courage of individuals like Bishop Gwajima and institutions like the Tanzania Episcopal Conference in speaking out is noteworthy. However, ensuring a society where such courage is not constantly required because rights are routinely respected is the larger goal. This requires a commitment from the government to uphold the rule of law, protect its citizens, and tolerate dissent. Ultimately, the controversy surrounding the Glory of Christ Church is a microcosm of larger tensions. It highlights the ongoing struggle for the soul of Tanzania. Will it be a nation where power is concentrated and dissent is silenced? Or will it embrace the principles of openness, accountability, and respect for human dignity? The answers to these questions will determine whether Tanzania moves towards a future defined by greater freedom and justice, or one where fear continues to dictate the boundaries of public life. The stakes are undeniably high.